I'm Maria Heron, and today I'm interviewing Richard Rossner and Rod Bolitho about their book For Multilingual Matters, Language Education in a Changing World. Richard and Rod have enjoyed long careers in language teaching and learning, as well as teacher education, and both are now freelance and are devoting most of their time to writing. Richard, why did you decide to write Language Education in a Changing World?
Hello, Maria. It's a bit of a long story. It really came out to think of the fact that both Rod and I have had this long career in language education that you mentioned, and time enough over those many years and many experiences in different parts of the world to come to a view of language education which we think has not been mirrored in other publications that we're aware of. So we wanted to put that forward to talk about the way that language is so key in all of education, not just in education, foreign language education, for example, or in mother tongue education, and that there should be a much greater emphasis put on the role of language in education and across the field, especially given that the world has changed so much over recent decades, and that language, if you like, has become that much more essential as a transversal skill, if you like, for everybody, especially for the young people going through education.
Right. Rod, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think just to endorse Richard's view on this, I think what we've tried to do is to take a much more holistic view of language in the educational world than has been attempted before. There are lots of books that deal, methodology books and background books that deal with English as a foreign language or English as a second language. Lots of books on applied linguistics with the research dimension emphasized, but no books, as far as we know, which bring together all the different issues in language education between the covers of one book. And that's what we've tried to do with this book.
Right. Rod, I was interested by your subtitle, Challenges and Opportunities. Can you give some examples of each?
Yeah, you know, many of the things that Richard has just talked about can be reformulated as challenges. So what does it mean that we now have transnational views of education, that young people are going from one country to another to complete their university education, for example, that academics no longer stick to their birth country necessarily, but very often travel from one country to another. And we're seeing much more emphasis on English as an international language in those contexts. People studying in English, people teaching in English in higher and further education institutions across the world, not just in Europe. These issues have grown exponentially in the last few years to such an extent that we feel teacher education should start taking account of them. And one of the challenges is in teacher education, where particularly in the education of teachers of subjects other than languages, there's very little language. So how to mediate your subject effectively, either in your own language or in another language, doesn't really get addressed in teacher education. And that's been one of the challenges that's really moved us to write this book. Richard, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yes.
About opportunities.
Yeah, I can certainly, looking at the other side of the coin, what are the opportunities? And well, that is one of them. From what we know, teacher education not just in language education, but across the subject spectrum, seems to be pretty, how shall I put it, pretty specialized. Teachers are, first of all, given background in the teaching of their subject, and then given some general pedagogy about the teaching of that subject. There is little consistency, so far as we can tell, about how the issue of language and communication in education, in learning, is dealt with across that subject spectrum. And there is so much more, we feel, that could be done. And in the last chapter of the book, we mention some of the opportunities that we feel are there for moving things forward, so that actually teacher education is more coherent, first of all, and that there is more in integration among different subjects, which could lead to better cooperation amongst teachers of different subjects in education, and a more exciting and more enlightened approach to language and communication from the student's point of view. And they are the ones who desperately need a clear, shall we say, opportunity to develop their language competencies and their communicative ability in this very changing world.
That's interesting. So what kind of readers did you have in mind when you wrote the book?
Well, we've talked about teacher education, and perhaps top of the list are teacher educators. And we don't just mean teacher educators who are specializing in language, or people working in universities where there are teachers courses and PGCEs or BEds and MEds which focus on language, but rather across the subject spectrum, as we've mentioned, and not just in the English-speaking world, but as far as we can tell internationally, this is an issue. And many teacher educators are well able to cope with a book like ours in English, which we hope is reasonably readable and not too specialized around the European or indeed the British milieu. Aside from that, there are opportunities, we think, to expand language education to encompass a much more diverse area of language. For example, within the European area, particularly in the Council of Europe, there is a strong emphasis, as you're aware, on plurilingualism, the ability of students and indeed everybody to be able to cope, however superficially, nevertheless to be able to cope with different kinds of language in international gatherings, in migration situations, and to cope with different varieties of their own language and different ways of using that language. So if you like, the repertoire of students needs to be expanded, and there are opportunities to achieve that if teacher educators and teachers work together on this.
I see. So that leads to another question. What can an interested reader, like the ones you just mentioned, hope to gain from your book?
Well, it's divided into four main areas. The first is about language and learning, the role of language in education, and about specifically language education, including how English has come to have a special place in language education worldwide. A second area is teacher education, including teacher professional learning, continuing professional learning, not just as regards language teachers, but also teachers of other subjects, teachers of the language of schooling, teachers of the sciences, history, and so on. And the third area is about stakeholders, people who have a keen interest and an immediate interest in education working well. That is, of course, the students, their parents, the teachers who work with them, the educators themselves, but also at a higher level, society itself, and the way that good education, good language education, can affect the employment opportunities and the self-realization opportunities of students leaving school. The last area is the one I mentioned, which is where we try to put forward, after a brief summary, what we consider to be, quote, the new paradigms, and mention these, list, if you like, the opportunities, albeit with challenges, that we consider to exist, and make some fairly definite proposals, albeit not related to a given context. So I think any reader who is interested in language will find that there is something to gain from looking at this book in one way or another, whether they look at it from beginning to end or dip into one section or another.
Okay. Rod, how might a teacher educator use your book during a course?
Well, you know, one of the things that we found out in looking across many different countries at teacher education programs was that there are no modules on language in standard teacher education programs. So, you know, if you've got a teacher of geography, a teacher of sociology or whatever, as Richard said before, the main content of the course is subject matter and pedagogy, but the whole issue of language is more or less neglected. So what we'd like to think is that the book, with the 4 sections that Richard has just been talking about, the 4 main chapters, actually suggests a design for a language in education module which could be implemented, could be designed and implemented in an existing teacher education course as a module in its own right. And what makes that particularly attractive is that it crosses subject boundaries. It would cross subject boundaries in ways that you know, reflect the language across the curriculum movement, which was so powerful in the UK in the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century. This would then allow anybody using the book to cross-refer between the teaching that they're doing and the questions which arise in the book. At the end of each chapter or section, we have discussion questions, which can either be questions for reflection by an individual, or they could be the subject matter of a seminar in a university teacher education context. So as a teacher educator, I would find a book like this to be a resource which could be drawn on in all sorts of different ways, but primarily maybe for giving the bare bones of designing a module which could be taught in language in education or language across the curriculum. It could have a variety of names. There are some countries in which there are examples of this, and we've quoted those in the book, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule. And if we achieve one thing through this book, it would be to push higher up the agenda the whole issue of language in teacher education for teacher educators and for those people who design teacher education courses.
Right. I think we're all aware of the trend towards English medium education in different countries around the world. So do you envisage a continuation of this trend in the years ahead?
Well, we're not, either of us, supporters of the so-called hegemony of English, and certainly not of the hegemony of English in education. However, like it or not, I think the trend is likely to continue for a while yet, simply because people see it, parents see it, students see it as a way of opening up their career opportunities for the future, giving them more options in the future. And although in some cases it's done how shall we put it, in a less than desirable way. Nevertheless, both at school level through, for example, CLIL programs, which are very content and language integrated learning programs, which are quite common now in the European area, and in universities around the world, which are starting to run English language programs alongside their own programs, it's likely to continue. Whether it will expand at the same rate as it has recently is another matter. I have a personal concern about the whole issue of the role of English in education, and that is that it has the potential to increase inequality of opportunity amongst those leaving school and university, because in many cases the cost of studying courses in English, going to institutions which provide whole degree courses, or at school level dedicated subjects in English, whether CLIL or in bilingual education, those costs tend to be higher, which means that gaps are already emerging in some places between those students who are able to participate in those courses and those who are not. So that is a worry. It's a worry, of course, for other aspects of education, not just this. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Rod.
Yeah, just a very quick postscript to what you've been saying. I totally agree with Richard that we've not set out at any point to push the cause of English as a medium of instruction, or English as the medium of CLIL. And I think it's worth saying that a book like ours could apply to any teacher teaching in any language, in any context. The issues that, some of the issues that it raises about language sensitivity, language awareness, and so on, would apply to the teaching of any subject in any language. But it becomes even more important in contexts where student mobility is very high, in places where students are not learning through their mother tongue, but through the language of the host nation, and the need for teachers to be sensitive to their students in this respect is something that I think we both feel very, very strongly about, whatever the language of instruction may be and whatever the context may be. So it's just to, if you like, just to endorse Richard's view on this.
Okay, Rod, Richard, thank you very much for this discussion, and good luck with your book.
And thank you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for hosting this discussion.